Hey everybody! So today we'll be talking about section 5.4, which is on the impact of agricultural practices. Now I know that we got into some of this with our 5.3 notes on the Green Revolution. So today we'll just be going a little bit more in depth into some of these things that were already introduced and introduce a couple newer things too. So learning objective for today is that you can describe the agricultural practices that cause environmental harm. You're going to learn about some of the different practices such as tilling, slash and burn farming, the use of fertilizers, and something called monocropping. So we'll start with monocropping. And this is going to be where you grow one single species of a crop. Now, this typically is going to be happening with like corn, wheat, soy, the ones that we use a ton of with our food. And this is going to make it really highly efficient for harvesting, pesticide, and fertilizer application. So if you look at the picture here, you kind of picture those like rolling hills of agriculture that maybe you've seen. This is going to be with monocropping. Now, some of the downsides of monocropping is that it's going to greatly decrease biodiversity, which makes the crops more prone to pests, and there's going to be fewer natural predators. Then it's also going to increase soil erosion. So the crops are going to be harvested all at once. So the soil is going to be left bare. It's not like in a natural forest where you're having little bits here and there going away. This is going to be like everything's taken at once, and the soil is left just very barren. This is ultimately going to decrease habitat diversity for species living in that area, especially if you think that maybe there was a forest before where this crop area is. It's going to be much less diverse for the species trying to live there. So tilling is going to be the next thing. As you can see, this picture is an example, and this is where we're going to be using tractors ultimately to mix and break up soil to make planting easier. And this also is going to loosen the soil for the next group of plants as their roots are going down. So a problem with this is that it increases erosion by loosening the topsoil and breaking up leftover root structures from harvest. So you can even see evidence of this erosion based on the fact that as they're going, they're kicking up a bunch of dust because you're having this topsoil is no longer going to have those roots like actually kind of holding it down. Now, although in the short term, tilling is actually good for plants because it makes it a little bit easier for them to grow, over time it leads to a loss of organic matter and topsoil nutrients are going to be decreasing. So in the future, it's actually going to be not so good when you are trying to grow plants there. What this also leads to, as again we can see in the picture, is going to be increased particulate matter, like dust, getting kicked up into the air, which is going to cause respiratory irritation and isn't good for things like asthma. It's also going to lead to sedimentation in nearby water, which is going to increase the turbidity, which means it's going to be more cloudy in the water. So if you think about the fish who are trying to live there, now all of a sudden they're living in a really like cloudy river, and that's going to be a problem for them. So if we look at this picture here, this is going to show you like on the left-hand side, kind of your normal like no-till ecosystem. We've got worms burrowing, we have roots going deep, we have some organic matter on the top that will eventually break down and be added into the soil. And on the right-hand side, we have the tilled ecosystem, which if you can see up on top, it's a lot more like little particulates, which ultimately end up getting pressed and forming this sort of hard crust. And then we've got not so much of the like typical soil horizon going on here, but it's ultimately going to be kind of really compacted and not be as healthy. Another practice that often happens for agriculture is called slash and burn. And this is where we're going to be cutting down vegetation and burning it to clear land for agriculture and returning the reason they do it is to clear land for agriculture, but also to return those nutrients in the plants to soil. So it's a very quick way to get all those nutrients that are in the plants broken down into ash, which is ultimately going to get into the soil. Now, this is something that's commonly talked about with the Amazon rainforest and how a lot of the rainforest is being depleted because of this slash and burn for agricultural practices, which, although that's very much a problem, We're very quick to blame the farmers who are just trying to make a living in the Amazon rainforest area, but forget the fact that here in the United States, we basically did the same thing a while back, before we did not have like social media to put us on blast for it. So, although this is very much a problem, remember it's not just something that like farmers are doing in the Amazon rainforest now. It is something that has been done for a long time. We did it, they did it in Europe. So it's happened for a while now. So ultimately, what this leads to is going to be deforestation. We're going to be getting less forests, which leads to a loss of habitat, loss of biodiversity. We no longer have those trees to be taking in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And we're also going to be losing these plants, which are able to help with air pollution filtration. So it leads to more pollutants in the air. It's also going to release carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that are ultimately going to lead to global warming and increased temperatures. And again, this is also going to increase the particulate matter in the air, which is no good for people who have asthma. Another thing that it does is it's going to be lowering the albedo, which the albedo is the amount of like reflection of the sun's rays that we're going to be happening. So if you look at this diagram here, imagine on the left-hand side, these forests are going to be absorbing more of that. These forests are going to be reflecting more of it. This on the right-hand side is going to be absorbing more because it's like dark and dark absorbs. So we're going to lead to absorbing of more of those sun radiation, which leads to increased temperatures, which leads to the area being warmer, overall global warming. So trees actually help with more reflection with the albedo. We also have an increase in synthetic fertilizers, which synthetic fertilizers are ones that are made by man. They are not organic. And some problems that synthetic fertilizers are going to have is they ultimately don't return organic matter to the soil. They're just going to be spraying some like nutrients onto the soil, but ultimately we aren't getting that cycling of like decomposition and things breaking down and natural organic matter being incorporated into the soil, which ends up leading to a decrease in the water holding capacity. Because if you remember that like humus on or a layer of compost on top is actually going to lead to more water retention in the soil. So we're no longer getting that. So we're going to have less water holding capacity, and we are not going to have soil decomposers because if they don't have anything to decompose, they're not going to be there. What ultimately this leads to, which is kind of one of the big problems of synthetic fertilizers, is going to be leaching. And leaching is where we have water carrying excess nutrients like nitrates and phosphates into groundwater or into surface water as runoff. And so if we look here, we're going to have water coming down, and we're going to have this water carrying the excess nutrients off into the groundwater, or it's going to get washed away on the surface. Now, what this can do is contaminate groundwater, which we drink, which is going to be a problem, but it also leads to eutrophication. And eutrophication is where if you get a heavy rain, you have that runoff. The fertilizer is going to go into the local water source. It's going to cause an algae bloom, which is going to block out the sun, which is going to kill a bunch of the like plants on the bottom. Eventually, the algae will also die, which leads to more bacteria decomposing all these dead plants and algae, which leads to a decrease of oxygen, which leads to fish dying. So it's like this whole eutrophication process because of these synthetic fertilizers, which led to this whole process here. Now, if you compare this to organic fertilizers, such as using like manure, the main difference between these is that we are going to have organic fertilizers. They are releasing nutrients much slower because they're actually like tied up in that like manure, as opposed to just being like the straight fertilizers going onto it. And so this is why we do not see so much of like the leaching and eutrophication, because it's at a much slower pace. And so it's going to be more based on the typical cycling that historically the planet has always been doing. So that's why organic fertilizers like compost do not necessarily lead to these things when synthetic do, because it happens way faster. So this is going to be your practice FRQ for 5.4, where you will practice the skill of describing environmental concepts and processes. So I want you to explain one disadvantage of using inorganic commercial fertilizers. So that's going to be your practice FRQ, and those were your notes on 5.4 about agricultural practices.